role in this system, its resource base for lending would need to be increased and its governance structure improved. In this regard, there has been considerable progress in recent years, and further progress is within sight in the G20 process with regard to IMF quota reform. As part of our contribution to the global safety net, the Bank of Korea recently committed $15 billion to the IMF under the bilateral borrowing agreement. Nesting the regional frameworks into multilateral efforts for crisis prevention is of course no easy task and would require clever thinking on the design of conditionality and lending. I speculate that if warranted, the IMF could lend to the regional frameworks, which would in turn lend to their members in need. Alternately, both institutions may lend jointly to individual countries. A nested scheme is easier described than implemented, however. There are many technical but nonetheless critical issues to be tackled. For instance, who should own the conditionality of IMF lending to a regional framework? The regional framework itself or the ultimate borrower country? Who should be responsible for surveillance? And when multiple institutions lend jointly, whose money should receive seniority? I hope that the IMF will lead the research on the design and modus operandi of a multi-layered system of financial safety nets. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to the complementary roles that major central banks can play in crisis prevention. While it is hard to predict with precision what any future global crisis will look like, we can say with some confidence that it will be preceded by pervasive global liquidity disruptions. In this light, and given that the IMF resources are limited, the major central banks should better serve as the international lenders of last resort. And we should work together to find ways of integrating their roles into the system of financial safety nets led by the IMF, while at the same time also not undermining their independence. I chose the topic of the Chiang Mai Initiative, and I focused on that issue after I received a list of issues of interest prepared by the organizer of the committee. But I'll be more than happy to respond to some of the questions that you might have regarding Korean economy and the economies of the region. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm also comfortable in the podium as Mr. Kim. My name is Sugimoto, as introduced. First of all, I express my gratitude for presenting myself here. It's a great honor to attend the International Council meeting of the Bretton Committee taking place in Tokyo, and to speak in front of such distinguished members of the international financial community. I would like to share my thought regarding today's subject, which is evolving regional framework and global challenges, focusing mainly upon regional financial cooperation in Asia. There is something quite striking about the recent progress of globalization in the world economy. Amid this development, I would like to point out the two large trends in the world economy. The first is the development of the regional economies. Along with Asia's rapid growth, the countries of Asia are growing increasingly interdependent. Let me illustrate some figures. The share of intra-Asia trade in world trade has almost doubled from 7% in 1990 to 13.3% in 2011. Taken together with the fact that value of world trade has grown fivefold during this period, the value of intra-Asia trade has increased tenfold during the past 2 decades, approximately from 240 billion US dollars in 1990s to 2.4 trillion US dollars in 2011. These figures provide a vivid illustration of the cross-border expansion of trade in goods and services and the construction of supply chains amid the globalization of the economy. These events have developed into a major trend, not only in Asia, but also in Europe, North and South Americas. Second large trade is the capital flows have become liberalized and expanded to a greater extent under the floating exchange rate regime among the major currencies of the world. As a result, global money is growing at a pace largely surpassing that of real economy. Quoting figures again, the amount of external assets of banks has increased from 6 trillion US dollars in 1990 to more than 30 trillion US dollars in 2011, according to the statistics of the BIS. That is, during the past 2 decades, external assets of BIS reporting banks have grown by 5 times, in contrast to the threefold expansion of global nominal GDP during the same time period. It was during this process of global economic and financial transformation that the Asian currency crisis occurred in 1997 and the global financial crisis triggered by so-called Lehman shock broke out in 2008. And now today, we face the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. The currency crisis, which engulfed Asia during the period of 1997 to 1998, was not a conventional current account crisis, but a capital account crisis. As the Asian currency crisis spread rapidly from one country to another, it became apparent that the policy responses by one country alone are limited, and that support by the IMF would be necessary. At the same time, it became widely recognized that cooperation in the Asian region would be necessary in currency and financial matters. At the time of the Asian currency crisis, Asian version of the IMF, i.e., Asian Monetary Fund, was conceptuated and proposed. However, this proposal was not realized since it was considered premature and failed to gain support by the US and the IMF. Then the countries of ASEAN Plus 3, which include ASEAN countries and Japan, China, and South Korea, agreed upon the Chiang Mai Initiative in January 2000. After it started out as a network of bilateral swap arrangement, it has developed and grown in the direction of multilateralization. Today, it has grown to as large as 240 billion US dollars. Moreover, the Chiang Mai Initiative has assumed crisis prevention functions in addition to crisis response. These are respectively called Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization Precautionary Line and the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization Stability Facility. Furthermore, the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, called AMRO, has also been established to provide surveillance functions in Asia. In view of this development, I think the Chiang Mai Initiative nowadays possesses a significant part of functions of the IMF, and therefore could be deemed as a regional mechanism supplementing the IMF in the Asian region. In the Eurozone, the European Financial Stability Facility and subsequently the European Stability Mechanism has been established, enabling the EU to cooperate with the IMF to provide measures to cope with the Eurozone crisis. The ongoing supplementary and cooperative relationship between the IMF and the regional mechanisms is expected to progress further. In view of the globalization of the world economy, such as the intensification of regional economic ties and the expansion of global money, as I mentioned at the beginning, the supplementation of the IMF by regional mechanism will have greater importance from now on. Furthermore, coordination of the economic, fiscal, and monetary policies of the country around the world in order to prevent the occurrence of crisis should have much greater significance. The importance of surveillance by the IMF and the regional mechanisms has to grow even greater. Looking forward, I expect further strengthening and institutionalization of the Chenmai Initiative. In addition, I had better take into account so-called double mismatch in the case of the Asian currency crisis. That is, mismatches in terms of both currencies and maturities. If transactions in goods and services among the countries of Asia are largely settled in each of their currencies, then in turn leading to the development of financial and capital market of Asia and the activation of financial and capital transactions. This would facilitate the stable development of the Asian economy. When abundant savings and deposits in Asian countries could be utilized to mid to long-term sound investment in local currencies via local market, it would contribute to stability of currency and monetary matters in Asia. Then, bond market in the Asian region should be actively developed and appropriate measures should be pursued to this end. These would contribute to establishing the framework within which private industries can work with the backdrop of more stable and sustainable financial environment, while preventing the recurrence of financial crisis in Asia and providing adequate response in the case of crisis. The recent commencement of the direct exchanges of Japanese yen and the Chinese yuan in the market would also be beneficial for this purpose. Although I miss the absence of the governor of the People's Bank of China here. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got approximately 20 minutes we can have for asking questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please go to the microphone and tell us who you are. We have a speaker. We have a question here in the back.
Hello, Simon Kennedy from Bloomberg. A question for the governor of the South Korean Central Bank. A couple of years ago, there was a G20 meeting in South Korea, and the argument at the time between finance ministers and central banks, I think you might have been there, was whether there should be targets for current account imbalances. I think the US talked about 4%. And 2 years on, it was rejected, and then 2 years on, ironically, those key imbalances, let's look at the US-China one, according to the IMF forecasts, are within those bands, within those 4%. Is that luck and temporary, or have we seen a permanent shift there in those imbalances that the G20 would have been very grateful to know about 2 years ago?
The second question.
This is Nuri Rubini from Rubini Global Economics. I have a three-part question. First one is, the governor of the PBOC was supposed to be here. We know why he's not here. How much are the panelists concerned that geopolitical tensions in Asia might have a negative effect on trade and foreign direct investment within the region? Second question is, how much should we be concerned about a hard landing in China? Third question is, Governor Shirakawa said that monetary easing or quantitative easing has spillover effects. One of them is that the Fed is very aggressive with QE3. That might lead to a very sharp appreciation, say, of the yen or even the Korean won. Would the Bank of Japan consider responding to this aggressive US monetary policy, either by much more aggressive monetary easing in Japan, purchasing foreign bonds, or taking a different stance towards its own QE in a direction of something more open-ended, given that growth is weak in Japan, the yen might be appreciating, and there is a significant risk of deflation. In the case of Korea, how much the decision of the Korean Central Bank to aggressively cut rates twice is driven by concerns, again, about global outlook and excessive appreciation of the currency.
Gary Kleinman.
Thanks, David. I wanted to ask, all the speakers mentioned the Asia Bond Market Initiative and the progress or lack thereof, particularly in terms of the members in the region investing in their own local currency instruments cross-border. Yet paradoxically, foreign investors from outside the region have increased their participation rather dramatically, in that in Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, 20–30% of local government bonds are held by foreign buyers. Is this a new source of vulnerability in your view, or is this an overall contribution to bond market growth?
Okay, we'll take one more question in the back.
Basma Momani, University of Waterloo and CG. I have a question. What lessons or what advice would you give, let's be more specific, what advice would you give to the Europeans today? Having learned many lessons from your own financial crisis, what would you tell them today? Thank you.
Okay, why don't we address those questions? Governor Shirakawa?
Okay. I'd like to take up three questions. One is geopolitical. The second is foreign exchange market intervention. And the third is lessons from European financial crisis. The economy is not existing in vacuum. Political situation, social situation are affecting economy and also policy environment. As for geopolitical issues, what we have to bear in mind is that Asian countries as a whole are forming the important global supply chain network. China, Korea, Taiwan, and Japan are importantly forming a global supply chain network. In this regard, that means that all these countries are interrelated and interdependent, and therefore the stable condition, both politically and socially and economically, are quite important. On the issue of exchange market intervention, first of all, it is not Bank of Japan, but Ministry of Finance that is responsible for foreign exchange market intervention. Bank of Japan is taking into consideration the effect of yen appreciation on overall economy and price developments. Especially after the European debt crisis, yen tended to appreciate because of safe haven status. So to the extent that the uncertainty is created, yen tend to be appreciated. And this appreciation of yen is affecting the sentiment of exporters and profit of exporters and some others. But this is one of the elements which affects the economy. We are not looking at exchange rate alone. We are looking at various data, and one of them is exchange rate. But anyway, this appreciation is affecting Japanese economy, and that is one of the reasons why Bank of Japan strengthened monetary easing in the past few years. The lessons from European financial crisis. There are so many, but every crisis has its own uniqueness. And in the case of euro, of course, this is a crisis under the single currency. But the common factor which applies to European debt crisis, the US housing subprime loan crisis, and the Japan crisis can be found. One is the overconfidence due to very good economic performance. In the case of Japan, the growth rate was quite high. Inflation rate was quite subdued in the latter part of 1980s. in the case of